Hey friends, welcome to the Church Planting Podcast. I'm Greg Nettle and I serve as president of Stadia Church Planting, where we help you start thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. On this episode of the Church Planting Podcast, we have my good friend, Mr. Chuck Mingo, who serves on the Stadia advisory team. Undivided, the ministry that he leads, I've been through, the whole Stadia team's been through. We'll talk more about that later. Welcome, Chuck Mingo, to the Church Planting Podcast.
Greg, I'm so glad. I'm always glad to get to spend some time with you. So thanks for having me on.
I remember I don't know if you remember this, but when we first met just a few years ago, I think I said to you, I think we're going to become good friends.
I remember that.
Here we are today.
2021 or something.
Yeah,
that's great.
I consider you a dear friend these days. Chuck, I'm so delighted at your willingness to discuss what for many is a pretty sensitive topic these days. You know, you've helped guide me, you've helped guide Stadia as an organization as we've shifted to much greater kingdom diversity. And so what I mean by that is, racial diversity and how, if we want to see every child on the planet have a church, how do we as an organization become more diverse racially, culturally, ethnically? And how do I lead personally in an area where I've not had a lot of experience leading? And so I'll be forever grateful to you and your organization for that. But that's what we're going to talk about today, because one of the questions I get these days from lots of church planters and church leaders and business leaders is, okay, well, that's great. You want to be diverse and stuff, but I know there's a lot of different skills. And so I thought it would be just fascinating to have an African-American leader. And I mean, a world-class leader, quite frankly, and you've worked in all kinds of multiracial and cultural situations. Pass on some wisdom to all of us. So I'm here largely to just learn and listen today, Chuck. But let me open it up to you. When we talk about that, what's some of the things that we should be thinking about right off the bat?
Yeah, Greg, first of all, thank you so much for just the ways that you've continued to lean in on this and be a learner. And I think that's just such a critical piece to this whole journey of what God is calling us to in kingdom diversity. And what I can say is this, I've been thinking about this question, and the thing I would say is I find that cross-cultural relationships is a common way, and I think a classic way that God makes great leaders. So, early in the years of Crossroads, the church where I'm still a pastor today, we went to the spiritual giants who had helped shape the leadership of the church. So our spiritual mentors, people who were kind of further than we were on their spiritual journey. And out of that research, it was really research. It kind of got distilled into what we called the 5 windows of growth. And so what we saw is a common through line, no matter who it was, no matter if they were still on the mission field or never been on the mission field, if they were in corporate or not in corporate, if they were a pastor or if they were working in secular spaces, there were these 5 common windows that were true of all of their growth journeys. And they would say, these are the moments when I accelerated my spiritual growth. Number 1, first year as a follower of Jesus, right? The foundation that's laid as you come into faith with Jesus. Number 2, their first leadership as a follower of Jesus. And that could have been leading, back then we called them ushers, but like the Connect team or whatever it would be, right? Just a leadership opportunity. Third is crisis. God grows us through crisis and difficulty like nothing else. And that was a common thread in all of their stories, was a moment of crisis that really helped to propel their faith. Fourth was the first time they got to share their faith with another person. First time they got to be a part of someone else saying yes to following Jesus. And the fifth, and these aren't in priority order because all of them had these 5, was a cross-cultural relationship. So here you are, spiritual strength guru folks saying one of the 5 windows where I accelerated my faith in Jesus was when I had a cross-cultural relationship. And I think that's still true. And I think the reason for that is because when we're in a cross-cultural relationship, it's an opportunity to humble ourselves and be a learner.
Okay, let me stop you there. I wrote all 5 down because that's gold right there for us. But let me just ask you this. So one of the 5, the first 4 didn't surprise me at all, but the cross-cultural relationship, that did. Okay. So, because I want to jump in. I need you to define, like, I had lots of cross-cultural, what I would call interactions. Okay. And I don't think they really shaped my leadership. So could you define what you mean by cross-cultural relationship?
Yeah, that's a really good distinguisher. And what I would say is this, probably the place where you grew the most on this is when you were either under the authority of or accountable to people of color. That's where it really changes for many, many white leaders. Barna even did some research on this, that what you learn if you're in a cross-cultural interaction, you learn some things, but the deeper, richer, fuller learning really comes when you are in an accountable relationship to another person who is different from you. And that could be, a lot of times maybe that has been a spiritual peer or a friendship, someone that you said, hey, as a leader, I'm asking you to speak into my life, not just be someone that I interact with on a surface, but you get a vote in my life. You get a vote in how I think about my leadership. And I think that's really the place where all leaders can grow cross-culturally, but especially white leaders, when they have that kind of relationship with the person of color, I think it really is a catalyst for their leadership growth.
And so, Chuck, one of the things that you've spoken into my life, and now especially the Stadia advisory team, which you've been on that journey that's fully diverse racially now, went from being 12 white males to, being fully diverse racially, and also women, gender diversity on the team as well, which I'm really excited about, was, I really am accountable to you all and just, I would always give you permission, Chuck, and say, Chuck, look, man, if I'm saying something because a lot of times I don't know what I'm saying that's offensive or stupid or, it's not intentional. It's a lot of times the unintentional blind spots that, could you speak to maybe, okay, so let's say we've given Chuck Mingo, permission and asked him to speak into our lives on this issue. Chuck, what would be some things you'd say, hey, here are some common mistakes or, things that I see that leaders need to grow in?
Yeah. Here's one that comes to mind. And I think, 2020 was certainly an inflection point when it comes to race in America and when it comes to race in the church for a lot of different reasons. Right. And so one of the things that you saw coming out of 2020 was a lot of leaders saying, hey, we got to diversify our staff team. We got to bring in some different faces onto our team. Good thing to do. But here's the thing that I think we're learning is when you bring in someone who is different from the norm in your staff team or in your church, you've got to reckon with, what is my culture? Is my culture ready for that? Yeah. And I think a lot of leaders are probably still asking that question. Hey, we made this move, but what I may not have done is paused and asked the question, is our culture ready for this? Is our culture welcoming, or does this person have to assimilate in order to belong in our culture? And I think those are the kinds of questions that I would encourage leaders to keep wrestling with, because they're hard, Greg. I mean, look, the truth is many of the people who are listening to your podcast are leaders, and they're probably the primary shapers of the culture that they're in. And so, and I know this as a person who leads an organization. The culture of my organization, it doesn't take any effort for the culture of my organization to reflect me in many ways, because I'm the leader. But what that also means is things that are not in my wheelhouse, things that might come from a different perspective, I'm going to need to have guidance and coaching to make sure that I don't unduly impact the culture, or quite frankly, impede the culture from changing in the way that needs to change to become more diverse. Oh, that's one that definitely stands out.
Okay, let me dive into that a little deeper, because this is so vital. So one of the things you've taught me is there's a difference between being multiracial in your staff. That's great step. But you can be multiracial and still be unicultural. Is that the right one?
Yes.
One culture.
Absolutely.
So you could have multiracial and not really be diverse in the way you function. Can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. And Courtney Walton, who's on our team at Undivided. I love the way she says it. She says, you can want the face, but do you want the voice? And when you think about that, the questions to be asking if you want to be multicultural is, who gets a vote? Who's at the decision-making table in the organization? Because you and I both know there's a lot of times when I go into a church and I'll see people whose faces are maybe even up front and visible, but they're not at the decision-making table as the church is thinking about, or the organization is thinking about the culture moving forward. And I think that's something to just look at, because, and I want to clarify something. I think every great church and organization ultimately will be unicultural. And what I mean by that is you need a unifying culture. You need some common agreements, right?
Okay.
I mean, everybody who comes into the organization I lead doesn't have to necessarily have the same faith that I have, but they've got to understand that they work for an organization that has a faith perspective to it, right?
Yes.
And so I do think you want that, but if our culture is going to be all that it can be, is that person able to speak into the ways in which our culture may be unwelcoming to people who are still on a spiritual journey? And I need to be willing to hear that, because I don't want a culture that's antithetical or is pushing people away. I want this to be an attractive culture that's drawing people in to a curiosity of more. Why would you shake this organization around race rooted in Jesus? So I think those are some of the things I would say around the cultural pieces. Who's at the decision-making table? Who gets a vote? And how do you make sure that table is evolving as the organization is reaching different people?
Okay, so sometimes, Chuck, as a leader, I recognize that I'm swimming in water and don't even realize the water I'm swimming in, right? So let's get real practical. And we'll just, what kind of questions should I be asking of our culture to go, okay, I brought diversity onto the team, yeah, Chuck's sitting at the table. He has a voice. But, is this culture really diversifying, unified culture, but is it really diversifying with the voices at the table? Because it's hard to, you don't know what you don't know. You know what I'm saying?
That's right. That's right. That's right. It's interesting. I'll share two questions and then I'll share a reflection that I think is helpful from scripture on this. I think the first question is, why did I do this? Like, as a leader, ask yourself the question, why did I make this a priority?
Good.
And I think that's a good place to start to examine your own intentions. And then the second question is, what's the vision? What's the vision behind wanting to be more, I'll lead the witness a little bit. You talk about it as kingdom diversity. Greg, it's really interesting. This is what I was going to say scripturally. It's really interesting. You look in the scriptures, the church that Jesus launched in Jerusalem was, for the most part, pretty monocultural, right? I mean, most of those folks were Jewish, same culture, same kind of dynamic, right? But Jesus gave a vision of a church that was going to be multicultural. And it's really interesting as you look in the book of Acts, which is the early history of the church, you see this shift in, I won't say power, but you see this shift in activity from Jerusalem to Antioch.
Right.
And Antioch was a city where you had a very diverse church, right? You had people from all of these different nationalities and ethnicities who had come together in Antioch. And isn't it interesting that Antioch is the church that births and sends Saul out on mission? Antioch is the church where they are first called Christians, which of course we know was a derogatory term back then, but it spoke to something that was happening in the culture. And so I think for us, this is core to the heart of Stadia, right? I mean, you're the one who told me that right now in America, most kids 15 and younger are non-white.
Yeah.
And so if the vision of the church is a church for every child, then there has to be a church that's ready for those children, right? And is raising up indigenous leaders from the ethnicities and backgrounds of those children. So I think that's the thing that I'd be asking as a leader is like, why did I do this to begin with? And what's the vision? And I think from a kingdom perspective, it's a pretty compelling vision as to why we want to make progress in this.
Okay, so we started in the book of Acts. And so one of the things that's become so important for me and for Stadia, Chuck, is so the picture of, Revelation 7, people from every tongue, tribe, and nation worshiping together in the kingdom. And so that's really easy to go, that will be someday, right? That's really easy to do that. But the reality is every time we pray the Lord's Prayer, right? Your kingdom here on earth right now as it is in heaven. So this isn't meant to be someday. This is part of what the kingdom is already, and we should be a reflection. And so that causes me to ask the question of, okay, am I just bringing, a Latino or a Latina on my staff to be, a token diversity, or am I really doing this because I value the voice of my goodness, dominant culture, world culture,
right,
that needs to speak into the life of our organization and hear their voice, right? That's the real question we need to be asking. Okay, so Chuck, let me just shift gears here with you a little bit. And because you've worked in, in a lot of diverse organizations, what's it feel like for you as an African American man if you're in an organization where the dominant culture really is white, specifically white male, or with token females? What's the feeling that you walk into?
Yeah, Greg, and I think whenever I answer a question like this, I want to make sure I'm answering for me, right? So I can't speak to what it may be for others, but for me, there's a part of me that always wants to ask the question, is diversity a real value in this organization? Yeah. And it may be, and it may just be that this is where they are in the journey and the process. And so for me, I'm much more interested in the heart and the intent to pursue this from a biblical perspective than I am what I see as the current status of it. And part of me says, I don't know where I've not traveled all of Wyoming. I've not traveled all of Nebraska. I've never been in Nebraska at all. I have been to Wyoming. I'm sure there are multiple counties in Nebraska and Wyoming where you can have a heart for kingdom diversity as much as you want, and your church is going to look a certain way. Now, here's the interesting thing. This, the data would say, even in rural communities, things are diversifying. So I think sometimes, we talk about this a lot in our book. We talk about you got to look up and have a vision for this, but then sometimes you have to look again and ask yourself of communities of people who are in my neighborhood, who are in my community. And those could be places where I could begin to cultivate some authentic relationship. And a lot of times when you look again, you find, even if you're in rural, Eastern Tennessee, or if you're in Nebraska, or if you're in Wyoming, certainly if you're in the Southwest, there are opportunities to build those relationships. So I do think that's part of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So so much to unpack here. So, you know the story of Julie and I and our family. And I mean, the reality was we just knew that we couldn't stay where we were living for the past 30 years. And this is just for us, Chuck. I always tell people, this is just our journey. And we could become the followers of Jesus that we believe Jesus was calling us to be without living in proximity to diversity. And so, a year ago, we moved our family into the city of Cleveland, where we are now the minority racially on that journey. Now, that's not something maybe that everybody has to do, but sometimes we do have to ask the question about, where am I going on this journey? What's my next step? And it may not be moving, but what is the next step God's asking you to take, right? Now, at a real practical level, because I can't miss this, you said in our book, and I'm going, everybody wants to know about the book. And of course, I've read the book twice. So tell us about your book.
Yeah, absolutely. So Troy Jackson, who is a co-founder of mine of Undivided, amazing man of God. You know Troy well, also former pastor. Anyway, we wrote a book called Living Undivided, Loving Courageously for Racial Healing and Justice. And it'll be coming out in January of 2024. And we literally just sent that next version to our publisher. So we're excited about that. But partially the reason we wrote that book is to say, hey, how do we frame up the invitation here for leaders, particularly leaders of faith, to understand that something like race that has been oftentimes seen as, man, you don't want to touch that till you have to, because it can really be a divider in your church. Yeah. But instead, how do we flip that on its head and say, I think this is a kingdom invitation. I put it to you this way, Greg. It is, I think, one of the faithful witnesses the church will have to be relevant to the next generation. And I think we've already got evidence of that.
Okay. So we're all about starting, thriving, growing, multiplying churches for the next generation. And so we're irrelevant to the next generation. We're dead in the water with our mission and vision. And I think every church has to be deeply concerned about the next generation. So unpack that a little bit about why not being faithful in diversity is such a block to developing the next generation.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think it goes back to the statistics that we know to be true about the diversification in America. And so, the truth is my kids are going to have far more. And I grew up in Philadelphia, so I had other cultures around me, but the reality is my kids are going to have a much more diverse experience in this country than even I had. And that's in one generation. And that's just going to continue. And so I think that those young people, when when we see issues of racial discrimination, injustice, they're going to have personal relationships with people who are impacted by those issues. And when they come to church on Sunday, to the place where they are supposed to be learning about this Jesus who cares about the world, who came to redeem the world, if that's the place where they're not getting formed on how to view these issues and how to pursue these issues, I think it's just going to be a very obvious block for them saying, what, you mean to tell me our faith doesn't have anything to say about these things? I'll give you a quick story. We did an undivided cohort in a place in Ohio that, still the Midwest, right? So a lot of people have some kind of church background, but this was not a church. And we were doing this in a secular space, but they were using our faith-based content. And a young woman's in the group. She was, I think, an educator in the local area. And it's like week 3, Greg. And, we're talking about Isaiah 58 and, what does it mean to restore streets to dwell in, and kind of tying this call to justice to a biblical root. And she kind of at the end of the video pauses and she's like, wait a second, has this been produced by a church? Talking about undivided. And it was one of those moments when you're like, oh boy, this could go south, right? Because separation of church and state, she might be offended, all of those things. But here's what she said. She said, you know what? I've left my church because they weren't talking about these issues. And if you're telling me there's a church that's talking about this, I feel like God might be calling me back to church. And I never forget that story. And we've heard other stories like that. And again, I would tell people all day long, I'm not saying that this is the primary apologetic the church needs to have, but I think it's one of them. And I think that we have a unique opportunity.
Okay. So Chuck, here's confession time, right? So, so I was at River Tree as senior pastor for 25 years before becoming president of Stadia. And I've thought about that. I've done a lot of soul searching and reflection on all of these issues, but one of the things I've reflected on is I don't remember if I did, but I don't remember in 25 years ever preaching a sermon about racial diversity, reconciliation, even justice. We did, our church was really focused missionally on how we can help the poor, how we can, reach others in other countries, but never about building relationships and what it looks like to be brothers and sisters at the table together. And so that's one of those deep repentance things that I've had to walk through. And, again, all I'll say is you don't know what you don't know until it's revealed to you. So if you're listening and that's you, I'm with you. I've been there. Believe me, this has been a long, painful, and wondrous journey that I continue to be on, but it's because of people like Chuck. Now, you've mentioned you have this ministry Undivided, and that's really how we started diving in together, because we were just looking for ways. How can we help Stadia better as an organization, our staff and team members, church planters? How can we better understand these issues? Talk a little bit about Undivided, if you would.
Yeah. So Undivided really birthed out of, again, Crossroads Church, where I pastor. And in 2015, 2016, we created this experience, 6 weeks, to bring people together in cross-racial environments where they would learn about the racial history of the country. With, Troy, as you know, Troy Jackson has a PhD in civil rights history. So I think the way he talks about history is so compelling and spiritually rooted. And then helping people understand, okay, what does that have to do with where we are today? What does the scripture say about this? And what would it look like to be faithful followers of Jesus, pursuing racial healing, solidarity, and justice? And so in this 6-week experience, as you know, we've taken hundreds of folks, thousands of folks through it in hundreds of cities. And it's powerful. And it's a way, I think, for churches to begin to do exactly what you repented of, Greg. And I just want to say your humility to own that and recognize that, I think is profound. I really do, because, and here's the thing, I think it's so important for us to recognize the church always has 2 options when it comes to a cultural issue. One is to be reactive, and the other is to be proactive. And what you're inviting your leaders to do on this podcast is to proactively form and shape folks to have a biblical point of view on this before the issue hits your city, before body cam footage shows up in your city, before some other injustice happens in your city. And Undivided was really created to give churches like that a tool to do just that. And so that's what we do.
Okay, so we've got Living Undivided book coming out in 2024. So we'll be looking for that. We'll be talking to you again. I'm sure I'll try to get you back in the podcast then, but it's a book comes out, so we can get everybody jumping on that. Okay, if we want to, so just let me endorse Undivided. And I mean, I could list lots of amazing leaders right now who have gone through Undivided and who endorse Undivided. Many of our ministry partners that, have gone through and taken their staff and teams through and churches through. How do people get, if they want to get involved with Undivided, how do they do that?
Absolutely. The easiest thing is go to our website, undivided.com. Super simple. Undivided.com. We do something called Experience Living Undivided, which is an opportunity for you to do like an hour or so webinar, learn about what we do, how we do it, get a taste of our experiences. And then we'd love to have that conversation with you. And Greg, as you know, we also are doing things in the corporate space now.
Yes.
Through our line called Working Undivided. And so you might have some folks who are listening who are corporate folks who are wondering, hey, is there anything that could be an application for me in the corporate space? Same thing. If you go to undivided.com, we'd love to talk with you and love to connect with you.
Okay. So do that, undivided.com. I just can't begin to thank you enough again for how God's used you to shape my character personally, continues to do that, and the character of Stadia as an organization, Chuck. I guess, as we kind of have just a few minutes here as we wrap up, let's speak directly to leaders out there who are, really, I think you hit it on the head. Most of us, we don't want to be jerks in this area. We want to be kingdom representatives like Jesus. But man, we're scared a lot. Like I'm scared. Like there's stuff I don't post on social media because I'm scared it's going to be taken incorrectly and different things. What, can you speak to us? What encouragement would you give all of us?
Yeah, I'm so glad to have the opportunity to do that, Greg, because I want to say, this is what I would say to leaders who are watching this right now. I need you. And I don't mean I need you because there's injustice and I need you to help me address injustice. I need your life experience as a white leader. I need your story. I need the perspectives that you offer to me as a follower of Jesus that I'm going to get if I'm not in relationship with a Greg Nettle. If I'm not in relationship with Brian Tone, senior pastor at Crossroads, who's been a longtime friend. And so I think it's really important for your leaders who are listening and for you all who are listening to know, like, you have a role to play in this. And part of it is to bring the fullness of who you are to it. Your life experience, your perspective, even the way you view things that might be different from me. I've only been strengthened by being in cross-cultural relationships myself as a leader. And so I don't want to leave particularly white leaders in a place of feeling like all the learning and all the growth is theirs to do alone, because it isn't. You bring something to my life, Greg. You bring something to me that I need. And I'm so grateful that you're willing to be in friendship and relationship with me to offer that.
All right. Chuck Mingo, www.undivided.com. Go check it out right now. Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks, Greg.